I'm Shwa, and you are listening to Light Up with Shwa, a weekly podcast to open our hearts and minds on a journey with me. Welcome to Light Up with Shwa. This is the episode part 1 with Daniel Tutt. Hope you will enjoy. Greetings, Daniel. Good morning.
Hi, Shua. Thanks for having me. How are you?
Thank you. I'm fine. I'm glad you're here. So please introduce yourself to our audience and tell me what you do, and let's go from there.
Sure. My name is Daniel Tutt. I live in Washington, D.C., and I'm a scholar and an activist. I do work with primarily in the interfaith world, but with a particular focus on addressing Islamophobia. So for the past decade, I've worked very closely with different Muslim American organizations. You mentioned ISPU, the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. I was fellow and a scholar there for quite some time, and they're sort of the first Muslim American think tank. But they also are not just an academic think tank, they're a policy think tank. So they bring scholars to create policy briefings that will help shape the direction of governmental policy and to address things like discrimination and towards Muslims. I also have worked as a film producer and outreach director for an organization called Unity Productions Foundation, which is an American Muslim organization dedicated to working in the media space to try and push negative stereotypical images of Muslims and introduce some reform within the media space. And that's a very dynamic mission. I think it's actually something that's not really being done on a large scale by Muslims or others. And so I'm very passionate about that mission. What I also do there is try to use our films in community settings to facilitate relationships between Muslim Americans and others. And so, for example, right now I'm doing a lot of work with evangelical Christians and trying to create breakthrough encounters. My sense of this issue is that most of Islamophobia can be addressed through relationship building and through dialogue, and that most of it is actually politically derived, and that it does not stem from some kind of ingrained or intrinsic hatred. Rather, it's usually a result of a lack of interaction that people have with their neighbors. So I'm actually fairly optimistic about the future of Islamophobia in the United States.
What is Islamophobia, if you can define it or describe it?
Islamophobia is an irrational fear or form of bigotry or form of discrimination against Muslims or, importantly, people perceived to be Muslim. It's sort of the classical definition.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
People then debate about its causes and the forces that accelerate Islamophobia. And I've written a fair amount of in different policy briefings, but also in different academic research, trying to understand the forces that really drive Islamophobia and how we can get around them and even reroute them. Maybe some people believe Islamophobia is hatred of one religion versus another. Or maybe
usually that's the common narrative or understanding.
In some parts of the world that is a common narrative. Mm-hmm. I agree with you.
Okay.
I don't subscribe to that view.
Okay.
Personally. Other people believe that Islamophobia is an issue largely having to do with a lack of familiarity with Muslims. So, kind of like I was saying before, they believe that, this can be solved by showing people that Muslims are American, maybe they're patriotic, maybe that they are very, no different than you. They, the Quran and the Hadith also promote American values of, say, equality and freedom. So that's been a common approach that a lot of activists have put forward.
Yeah.
A third approach has been one that understands Islamophobia from a more critical lens, which basically argues that really this is a form of racism, which means that the primary way to understand that is that it has to do with social exclusion, political exclusion, and othering having to do with power and having to do with forces that are quite similar to, say, the experiences that African American communities have experienced post-Jim Crow. Okay. So a lot of Muslim Americans have kind of debated about which sort of strategy is most suited to overcome Islamophobia. And I've really been interested in pursuing a little bit of both strategies, to be honest with you. I think,
what's bringing you into this activism, and what's the driving force there?
I was always interested in religion. At first, I was interested when I went to college in a small school in Southern Oregon. I was interested in Buddhism because Buddhism has the general philosophy that life is suffering and that there is a way out of the suffering. And so I really became interested in this concept, and I've become more and more convinced that in our world today, suffering and collective suffering or collective trauma comes in a lot of different forms. And I think religion has been something that's very interesting to me through that lens. And once I became interested in Buddhism, which was actually an interest that was derived from reading poetry, which is a much longer story I won't get into. But once I was interested in that, I had the opportunity to come to Washington, D.C., and by chance, I found a group of kind of multi-religious organizations putting together a peace walk that was structured in the same way that Gandhi did his walks, the salt marches and things like that. It was in the same format, the same idea, but the focus here, this was in 2005, the focus was how do we address religiously motivated violence? And I became the main organizer of this walk. We called it the Unity Walk. And this was a transformative moment for me because I found myself in the middle of profound religious diversity, but also in the presence of people who had a lot of spiritual and religious wisdom and knowledge. And it had a real psychological effect on me. So I became very interested in the idea of interfaith work. So that's what originally brought me into it.
Okay.
And so that's basically my...
So the interest was there, and you must be a type of person who was open to all these ideas.
I was open to them, yes. I mean, I was raised an Episcopalian Christian, which is Anglican Protestant. But I really kind of ventured away from my congregation. I was not interested, really. Like I said, I was more interested in Buddhism. But interestingly, doing interfaith work in Washington, D.C., and then I went on to do AmeriCorps, what's called Volunteer in Service to America. And it's here, during a year of service, Washington, D.C., at a national nonprofit, that I met the Muslim community. And I met them in the context of really, I met them with the Unity Walk, but I met them also in the context of doing poverty work. So it was this connection of interfaith work with addressing poverty and justice that became very central to the whole idea of religion. So I became interested in this question of how do religions and interfaith action promote justice? So in that context, it's a post 9/11 world, and if you look at all of the religions in America, it's one of the richly diverse countries. The Muslim community was really experiencing the most intense discrimination, I think. And so I really started to read about Islam, work with the Muslim community more closely, and then I accepted a position at Unity Productions Foundation to sort of spearhead a national interfaith dialogue campaign called 20,000 Dialogues.
Yeah.
How do we move the needle in a more positive direction?
Yes.
And push back on Islamophobia, because there's a correlation between Islamophobia and support for authoritarianism, support for anti-democratic sentiment, support for really intense forms of conservatism. And the Muslim community is thrown under the bus by this political apparatus that really generates Islamophobia. It's very much a kind of cottage industry phenomenon of very specific groups and institutions that are sort of pushing it, accelerating it. And
what do they gain from that? Have you ever understood that? What is it? It's their limitations, their ignorance?
Well, I mean, as part of my studies in philosophy, I also studied social psychology and the branch called psychoanalysis. And that actually gives a lot of very constructive frameworks for understanding prejudice. And one of the most important things I've learned from studying that, and even from my own experience, has been that prejudice in all forms, whether it's Islamophobia or whether it's anti-Semitism or whether it's racism, they have different causes, there's different interest groups, there's different forces of power. But for the individual, what's really happening there is something that in the act of excluding, in the act of discriminating, there is an enjoyment that is derived. There is a kind of perverse enjoyment, and it's very often the case that people have prejudice. It's not operating at a conscious level. It's operating at an unconscious level. And I think that's very important, because if it's operating at an unconscious level, it's really, the prejudice is satisfying something, keeping something, blocking something. So it becomes a pathology. It becomes a replacement. And so this is why you get the phenomenon of scapegoatism, of the idea that the Jew or the Muslim is the scapegoat, or the Jew, the immigrant, the Mexican, the Muslim is standing in the way of my ability to achieve something. So that's a common trope of prejudice. And it's really interesting if you think about it, because by excluding them, by saying they're not a part of this country, they don't belong here, they're really doing two things at once. They're inserting a logic, a cause for their suffering, where they didn't have one before, but also there's an issue of an unconscious enjoyment that's also going on in the act of exclusion. So I know it's a bit complex, but that's one way that I've really found it to be quite helpful, and that's why, Anthony Bourdain.
Yes.
Well, he was very interesting because, as you know, he was very open to the Palestinians. And this is a group of people who really have no positive media representation. Yeah. They're not humanized.
Yep.
They're often radically otherized. Okay? But he was using cooking, which is a kind of universal medium of experience, and introducing himself to foreign cultures. And I think there was something very profound in that, because he broke down this scapegoat logic, this unconscious barrier. And when you do that, you're able to rehumanize. And that's why I think media and storytelling is actually quite powerful as a political act, because what it does is it allows for that unconscious fear barrier to lower,
yeah,
and enter into something. You can see them on a field of equality.
And not be threatened by every move of the other that you have in mind.
Yeah.
Very good, very good. Thank you so much. So, moving on from, before we move on to parenting, I would like you to talk about a little bit more about UPF so that people would know their work and your participating in it and how it is benefiting and what's the message.
The message is that we have a major deficit of the Muslim narrative, the Muslim story in the mainstream media spaces. And that this is a problem because there's a correlation between the lack of, about 65 to 60% of people in the United States have no personal connection to somebody of a Muslim background. And so everything they know is constructed from media images, whether news media, television, Netflix, movies, you name it. And all of the media tropes and frames and images that we've seen really ever since the dawn of the public relations industry and the dawn of media have really casted Muslims in a problematic light. So our organization is trying to be at the forefront of offering resources within Hollywood space. So one of the programs we have is called Muslims on Screen and Television. It's based in Los Angeles, and it actually offers free consultation to people that are writing television programs or Netflix series. And we've worked with some of the largest shows like Grey's Anatomy. We've worked with Bones. We've worked with The Simpsons, The Carmichael Show, a number of shows, Madam Secretary, where we're basically trying to introduce opportunities for the human image of Muslims to emerge. We've had some successes in this space because these are shows that reach millions of people. And we've had some challenges, as you can imagine. So that's one thing we're doing. Another thing we're doing is trying to really build a respectable media production company. We've made 11 sort of big PBS documentary films that tell different stories from history. We've told the story of the Prophet Muhammad from a kind of humanistic point of view, not from a religious point of view.
Yes. And it's part of, those series are part of 20,000 Dialogue that people can get and have a dialogue on it, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
That's our third area. So make these films, and then our third area is trying to use the films as a tool for creating educational opportunities. But some of that's actually policy-oriented. So we've made several films that take on policy-related issues too, say Islamophobia, and we'll introduce that to the Department of Justice, State Department, even the White House, not the current White House, but former, and try to educate at all of the different levels of society. So
now, would there be a gap now? Because if you're not interacting with the current people in the White House, is that what it is? And that's an additional challenge?
That's a great question. The Trump administration has presented a profound challenge to American Muslim organizations. And I mean that because for most of the national Muslim groups, from ISNA to MPAC to some of these large associations that are that ostensibly represent the entire Muslim community, which is the most diverse religious community in America. So it's almost impossible to have one organization do that. But all of these groups have had to decline cooperation with the federal branch of government, which is different than the prior two administrations, the Bush administration and the Obama administration.
Yeah.
I mean, remember, George W. Bush was inviting Muslim leaders into the White House following September 11th, and he created a whole partnership strategy globally and domestically that would sort of use Muslim communities and Muslim leaders, from imams to leaders of organizations, as the sort of front line in what they called cultural diplomacy. And the Trump administration stopped the momentum of that, which had been going for about 15 to 16 years. It's very interesting. I mean, it's only been since Pompeo has taken over the State Department that they've reintroduced some things like observing the iftar, which they now do. But of course, all of the Muslims they invite to the White House iftar are international Muslims, and none of them are really domestic.
That's interesting.
So it's complex, but basically, I don't think it's a void. I think the Muslim organizations have taken a principled stand, and it's been the smart and wise decision not to work with the Trump administration, because the rhetoric is simply too toxic and too out of touch with reality to respond to.
So what is the solution to going around it? If we are not connecting to the main center of the administration, then what are the best ways that you can propose for Muslims at this time, till we have any change, to work around it but continue the work? I'm sure you are doing it, but what other ideas are there, if you can?
Yes, I think there's a lot of things that people can do from the standpoint of engaging conservative communities. I would say there's actually a lot of opportunity there even. There's a huge swath of Americans who are completely disengaged from voting, from civic engagement, from the political process. And, they are, I think, rightly cynical about the direction of our country. And a lot of these people actually don't harbor prejudice. Like I said, most Islamophobia is kind of orchestrated. It's really a kind of political football that certain interest groups use to distract people from the real source of problems. So then Muslims, I think, have a huge opportunity at the local level, and I think it would really have to happen at the local level, city council, community associations, things like that, for forging authentic and real connections to people. So that's number one. You don't need to rely on national organizations or a national strategy. In fact, if you look at the polls from the Pew Forum, majority of Muslims in America, only, I think, 23%, something very low, identify with a national Muslim organization.
Yeah.
So vast majority of Muslims do not feel that there is a national strategy for combating Islamophobia. So really it is a localized strategy. You know what I mean? And I think that's where it really comes down to. And I think in that also, for people that live in urban areas, it's very important for racial solidarity with the African American community to happen, because the African Americans are the second largest racial and ethnic group within the Muslim space, and they often are actually excluded from within Muslim leadership okay? I think you have to be really, really patient with people, and you have to understand that people are victim to these huge campaigns that have generated fear about the religion and about the culture and about Muslims. And in many ways, you kind of have to be compassionate for that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I understand. This is very important because what happens is that you are basically, what I'm trying to understand is saying that engage at all levels and be patient and learn about your communities and be there, out there, be there.
Yeah.
Participate in different community events or create events, or like be part of own your communities. Be engaging with all kinds of Muslims and Christians and everything. And interfaith work, that's where it comes in, right?
Yeah. Well, interfaith work is just simply the easiest. Actually, there's a new poll that was recently done. I don't put too much stock in polls because I think public opinion always changes, but I want to share one interesting thing that people that are non-affiliated with religion are the least Islamophobic. In fact, Muslims, I'm talking people identified as Muslim, have more Islamophobia than Americans who are non-affiliated with religion. So this is a shocking insight, and it shows that the apparatuses that generate fear of Islam and fear of Muslims is even impacting Muslims themselves. Okay, so that's very important to recognize, and I think it's something that, in the Holy Scripture of Islam, it's very clear that the people of the book, the Jews and the Christians, are your cousins. They're closest to you, and so it's very natural for Muslims to have relations with them. But what's interesting is today, majority of people that see through the facade of Islamophobia, they're not religious. You see my point? This is something people should
Yeah, that's a very good point. Thank you for that.
There's certain communities that not only, it's not an individual question,
that's
leadership question, and this is the challenge we run into with evangelical communities. I know a pastor in Texas who decided to form a relationship with an imam, okay? And in the act of doing that, and he made it public, that he does public events with this guy and so on, he lost 1,200 members of his congregation. They left.
Oh, wow.
But he used that as an opportunity. He kept on doing it. And he got new Christian followers that were more diverse, more open-minded. So it was kind of a
filtering system.
Yeah.
Not to say that they might come back also. Anyways, that's very good, very good. Are you a parent?
I am a parent.
Okay, so how many children? And
I have a boy and a girl. And
how old are they?
I'm 37, and I have a beautiful wife named Beth. And we met in our home state of Oregon when we were in college in about 2003. And Eva, my oldest, is 6, and Elijah, my youngest, is 3.
Oh, wow. Cute age. All right. So from there, I would say, what type of parent are you? How do you identify yourself on the scale of, if you want to go from 1 to 100 or 1 to 10?
Lord only knows. I would say I'm a pretty good parent. I try to be very consistent. And I try, frankly, to learn from the past and learn from my own difficult experiences with family life when I was growing up. I had in many ways a beautiful childhood, but also in many other ways a very difficult childhood, because my mother, she went through 2 divorces. One when I was 4 and one when I was 17. And both of them were very difficult. So that really informs my higher values and my higher principles that I bring to parenting.
Thank you for watching Part 1 with Daniel Tutt. Please subscribe, Light Up with Shwa, and stay tuned for Part 2 with Daniel Tutt. Thank you. Thank you for staying with me through this exciting episode. Please don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for the next episode of Light Up with Shwa.